Welcome to another episode of Health Creators. This is Liv, and joining me here today is Stephen Keenan, founder and CEO of Filter. So, Stephen, can you explain why you started this company and how you arrived at it? What was the journey?
Filter is a digital therapeutic that focuses specifically on helping COPD with their psychosocial problems. How I got into it, my uncle has COPD, and he ended up calling me, I'll never forget, he called me at 11 p.m. on the 1st of May, 2020. So sort of COVID was sort of kicking off. People, there was no lockdowns yet in Europe, but there was definitely a feeling things weren't right. And he lives in the Philippines. And he proceeded to tell me for 7 hours on the phone how he had gone from a hospital bed with his condition to now swimming, cycling, setting up a business, building a whole self-management plan for himself. And I always took a lot of interest in this, both from because he's my uncle, but also I was super interested in this tech platform he built. And I guess that was the start of it. I didn't really know much about the condition until then, and sort of went away, looked at the market, saw it was ridiculously underserved as an indication versus say diabetes or hypertension, etc., and realized there's something here, there's something to sort of build. So I'd say that is the short version of how I got here. I'd say in terms of why I sort of latched onto it, I would say initially was I always wanted to be, when I was younger, a doctor.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was 16, I worked in a sort of one of the biggest hospitals in Ireland. I did a sort of a week-long internship or transition year, what we call sort of transition year week. And I was put on the oncology first research and then onto the wards. And the trainee doctor who I was shadowing thought I was actually a medical student. Because I look quite old. I really haven't, you can ask my friends, I look basically the same as I have the last 10 years. And he brought me around and he proceeded to basically tell, I'd say in the first day, 7 or 8 patients that they were going to pass away within the next few weeks. The treatment that they were trying to work just wasn't working. And I remember going out and I remember telling my parents, and I was like, is that the job of a doctor? I was like, that was tough. I was like, there's no way I'm built for doing that day in, day out.
Yeah.
So I always wanted to build something in healthcare that was maybe not necessarily in the weeds of on ward. So when my uncle sort of gave me this opportunity, I saw it as a bit of a aligning of the stars and sort of jumped at it.
And your background's in machine learning?
Yeah. So I actually studied originally an undergrad, did a dual major in business and law. Realized that wasn't something I wanted to do. So I had my hand at another actually digital health startup in college or in uni. And then my intro to tech was that, plus ended up working in Deliveroo quite early on in Ireland. And then sort of did a few other things and then managed to go back to uni and did computer science with a focus on machine learning. Yeah.
Interesting. And is that why you focused on digital health and this kind of digital component of it? Because you worked at Deliveroo, then you went and did computer science, machine learning. What was the kind of marriage between that and healthcare for you? Yeah,
I think, again, there's probably 2 things. One being, in digital health, you do have that, I would say, separation from the front line. You're not a nurse, you're not a doctor. You do have that degree of separation. Maybe unless you're a telehealth company or something where you actually are engaging with patients via video. A bit different. But also then, I think one of the things I ended up doing in between my undergrad and let's say the master's, I ended up working in Ghana for a while in microfinancing down there. And I remember so I actually ended up living with a bunch of doctors down there. And they were working in the hospitals, sort of working, but also, I guess, sort of quasi-volunteering. And they would come to me every evening and describe the situation that they would see, patients not getting access to medication. The go-to was basically that a patient, if they needed medication, a family member would have to go to a local pharmacy, buy it, bring it in because hospitals would be out of business. overnight if they paid out of pocket. And I just realized like there's no way our healthcare system can scale to these developing countries. Like it's never going to happen. People are still going to die of conditions that you can largely treat. So I think something in healthcare that does scale is like building things that does scale in healthcare is just super important. So I think marrying those sort of two things ended up in the sort of digital health space.
Yeah, because I guess everyone has a phone mostly.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like down there, it like you really have to go down there to appreciate that. Like the phone, everyone has a phone. Like you genuinely could be one of the poorest people that I met, and you still have a smartphone of some sort. Like they have different models to us for sure, and these things cost like $10 to buy down there, but there's still a smartphone. And they still have internet. Everyone has internet down there, and they all bank via the internet, via phone credit. So they have a completely different system, but it's still a means to deliver services. And one of those services that you can deliver within certain boundaries is healthcare.
When we talk about digital therapeutics, I think a lot of people get confused between, you already know what I'm going to ask, between, digital therapeutics and this lifestyle app, right? And there's a lot of that maybe recently as well with the markets turning and valuations going down, in that people are switching strategies. People are saying, hey, we don't want to have this be, prescribed anymore. We want, consumers to pay for it. So what are your kind of thoughts in this market and what you're building right now?
Healthcare moves very slowly. So digital therapeutics ultimately is a very novel therapy, I would say. And if you look at maybe historically how therapies have come to market, it's slow. Like changing perception, even around like how do you do a clinical trial around a digital therapeutic or a new therapeutic? How do you regulate them? How do you build like the correct team around them? And then of course, how do you actually get paid for them? And if you really look back, digital therapeutics from something that like consumers or patients can use have been around for like that are chasing chronic conditions or conditions that are treated like from a treatment point of view have been around like 10, 12 years. And we've got through the barriers of, okay, we know what trials and how to run them. We know the teams we have to build. We know the regulatory pathways. And now we're starting to see reimbursement models develop. Europe, Germany, France, Belgium sort of championing that. So I would probably say that what happened, the sentiment right now is much as a result of what's happened in the US. And what happened there was they absolutely flew ahead with what I said around like clinical trials, building the correct teams, like getting efficacy, all that sort of stuff. But then they got to the point where they're like, oh, okay, who's going to pay? And they're charging, ridiculous amounts for that. Whereas you look at Europe and the sort of technology and the business and the company sort of construct was a lot slower. And then a couple of years ago, this business model opened up by way of DIGA. And everyone was like, okay, well, now we actually have a reimbursement code, essentially, for these things. And we know that they're possible and they're efficacious. And so I think a lot of digital therapeutic companies are sort of focusing on that market.
But is the biggest difference between a digital therapeutic and, a lifestyle app, is that really just the reimbursement model, essentially? Like, who pays for it? Is that the defining difference?
No, I think effectiveness is. I think a lot of the consumer apps, I would probably think, and I won't say any names on them, but my sort of thought process is there are a few consumer apps out there who have maybe been in the consumer market for quite some time around mental health. Yeah. And we've yet to see any of them really release an effective clinical tool. And I wonder why that is.
Do they just not have the data, you mean?
Yeah, do they not have the data? I mean, like these companies are consumer products, and the consumer products, like what's your main driver there? Retention, engagement, growth. So you will optimize that for days because that's what investors want to see. But does that mean you're actually generating the right outcomes? Maybe not. I mean, like, the thing is, they could be sticky as hell, but like, so is Instagram, and that's not good for your mental health.
Yeah.
So I would maybe look and say, okay, well, these things are super sticky, but put in the hands of people that maybe really need them, and maybe versus the people who are using them because they, like the experience. Are probably where they're maybe struggling to build that efficacy.
So I'm a patient with COPD, and I'm feeling pretty bad about my COPD. How does your app actually help me?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that we're focusing on is the experiences, I guess, a typical COPD patient would have, and what makes the life difficult outside of just like the physical symptom management, is that they're often they're often older. So they're often in their sort of late 50s, 60s, 70s, often have probably a relatively bad lifestyle from a lower socioeconomic background. And the immobility of the condition often means that they probably don't really leave their house a lot. So you have a host of different problems there around like isolation, from the immobility problems. You have sort of worries around money because, they probably can't work either, and they're on benefits. And then of course you have the experience that, I have never felt it. I can only talk to, at this point, hundreds of patients that have that breathlessness feeling where you wake up every day and you think, is this my last breath, every breath?
Yeah.
And the fear that sort of encompasses engulfs their sort of mindset. And so you create all of these sort of things, and it becomes like quite a complex case to try solve. And I suppose what we sort of focus on is primary thing is, how do you manage that breathless feeling? Because you're going to feel it. How do you stop yourself from getting worked up about it to the point where you might think you're having, for instance, an exacerbation, when in reality you're actually having it sort of worked yourself up into a panic attack?
Yeah.
So that's the sort of primary focus we do initially. The sort of second thing then we focus on is, how do you reframe how you view life and live your life with the context of the condition? So you're no longer young and healthy. You're sort of maybe older and struggling to do things, and it's sort of accepting that and adjusting your lifestyle as such. And then sort of the third thing is, how do you sort of bring that learning or that sort of reframing of your life and try help people around you understand that as well?
I see. So it's a habituation to essentially the symptoms you're definitely going to face, right? Because you need to just get used to the fact that this is how life is going to be now, and there isn't really a way of solving that. So it's more like, okay, here's how you can cope with these symptoms, and then here's how you can live a new life, and here's what people around you need to know.
Correct. Yeah.
And is there a way you see this solution actually being able to improve outcome measures? Because in your uncle's scenario, you talked about him being in this hospital bed, and then, now being able to actually go and enjoy and live his life.
Yeah.
But that sounds like, the outcomes were actually better after he had changed the way that he was doing things. So is there an element of this digital therapeutic that actually allows people to improve their lives and actually feel better rather than just habituate the symptoms?
Yeah, so I think we have done sort of feasibility and pilot studies, and it shows that we are. So our clinical endpoint, primary thing that we look at is the HADS, which is Hospital Anxiety and Depression Score. In the US, they use PHQs as sort of various different clinical measures. And our thing that we're looking at is, what's our reduction in the anxiety over time.
But anxiety is not the reason you're in a hospital bed, right?
Well, the thing is, like, it can be. So you could actually end up being in hospital because you think you're having an exacerbation, but you're having a panic attack. And so
Interesting.
So you could get treated, actually, and this happens. You could go into hospital, say, I'm having an exacerbation. The doctor, because they're busy or whatever, they might like misdiagnose that you are having exacerbation, you get them pumped full of steroids, and you get pumped full of maybe prednisone. That is like one of the worst drugs that a human can take. It is.
What is prednisone?
Basically, it makes you feel amazing, and then it makes you feel awful. Essentially, it makes you wired. Like that call that my uncle sat on with me for 7 hours. So right through my night, it was his early morning because he was in the Philippines. He was on prednisone at the time. And it's genuine. You are wired as your body sort of is kicked into sort of fighting things. So yeah, I mean, there are cases where the anxiety that is caused from your COPD makes you, therefore you end up in hospital because of that. Not necessarily because of your COPD, because the anxiety has got you there.
Yeah.
But I think for us, like when people start feeling a bit more confident in their condition and reframing it, they start to like see life a bit differently. So we have countless sort of patient testimonials and feedback from our trial users around this, like people, you know, having not left their house for 6 months and having sort of passed through the therapeutic, having left.
See.
And so it's like engaging with society again and being able to actually live their life a bit better than they were before. And that's like, you know, this is how we view it, just therapeutic one. This is sort of like an onboarding, how we look at it, sort of like an onboarding onto COPD. There's obviously like various other different ways that you can, from a long-term management point of view, intervene as well and help the patient. But we very much see this as the sort of first and the most essential step.
So this is more like, it's more like the reason why they are not really interacting with society is because of a mental block, right? And that you help them overcome that.
I think it can be part of it, yeah. And to be fair, I mean, like the framing that they have is often very valid. You know, they may have gone for a walk and experienced an exacerbation. Therefore, the association with walking is I'm going to have an exacerbation.
Yeah.
So if you go into a pulmonary rehab program, which is basically a bespoke physio exercise rehabilitation program for COPD patients and cystic fibrosis, etc. If you go into one of those and a nurse tells you, okay, we're gonna now do like, you're gonna do 500 steps tomorrow or for the next week, and then we're gonna build you up to 1,000. You're like, hold on, no, I'm not, because last time I did that, I had an exacerbation. So it's about sort of realizing that the exacerbation happened maybe because you either in coincidence or maybe you push yourself a bit too much, and it's about finding your limit. So there is like a host of things we have to solve there for. Yeah.
And so you were at Deliveroo before, and I would almost consider that as big tech. I don't know if others would, but how would you advise people who are, you know, in big tech and want to become, you know, a healthcare CEO? What's the number one thing they should do? And what is you know, example of that you kind of live by?
Young founders excel exceptionally well in new industries because essentially they can be, you know, they can stand up on LinkedIn or they can stand up at a conference and say, I know everything, you know, because no one is really there to say, no, I know more, or it's some other young person or so. The industry is so young that anyone who stands up can technically be the knowledge person, the most knowledgeable person in the room. Whereas with healthcare, you know, it's as old as time. And it's like a young person coming in, there is definitely skepticism from a large majority of the industry, and especially someone who didn't study medicine in uni. So what I would say is understand that things move like slightly slower, and that knowing the right people is important, and maybe not necessarily jumping into something thinking that you have the solution, but actually making sure you talk to the right people. The caveat to that is ensure you stay outside of the box, because getting too into the system will just tunnel your vision on things.
And then I think this is going to be a fun one. This is always a fun one. What's the number one thing not to do as a founder CEO, and what's a example of a situation that's happened to you?
Yeah, I actually I actually have a Notion list where I write. So every week I have this I create a page, and it has like personal, sort of not necessarily specific tasks to the company. My own personal one where it's sort of next week's task that will probably go into stuff I need to work, personal tasks. And then I have like this week's notes, and then I have some other headings. And this week's notes is basically just a year and a half of, if I was to start over again, just read these and make sure you don't do any of them.
Yeah.
So if I had that on me, I could probably pick something out. But definitely the thing that comes to mind, because it was something that probably derailed my thinking for quite some time, and I only probably recognized it the point in time at which I had the thought only a few days ago. So we originally were building hardware, and the reason for that was we actually didn't start off as a digital therapeutic, a pure digital therapeutic. We had a companion device.
Yeah.
Because we were focusing a lot on that physical condition monitoring, which I still think there's a lot of value there, but it's sort of, the way I look at it, this is a very long-winded answer. The way I look at it though is we were trying to help, let's say a patient wanted to go from self-management level 1 to self-management level 10. We were helping them with level like 4, 5, 6, where in reality, a lot of them need help at 1, 2, 3. So that's why we really made that sort of jump back to that stages. But we ended up building hardware, and I talked to a very well-known investor, hardware investor, probably the most well-known hardware investor in the world. And I sort of described the situation because at the time we were integrating into existing devices. And he was like, a hardware investor will never invest into a company that's not building its own hardware. And I maybe took that wrong, maybe took that incorrectly, and some other data points that I was looking at, and said, we need to build hardware. And off we went on spent a significant amount of time, not a lot of money to be fair, but a significant amount of time, and my co-founder's time, Andrews, on building hardware. And we eventually pivoted out of that into using existing hardware solutions again, and then eventually out of that. So my thing is, and there's loads of other examples I can give, is don't take everyone's advice. Take it and ask yourself, like, this could be Bill Gates, it could be Steve Jobs telling me this advice. But if you do feel it's probably wrong, don't take it just because it's from someone who you respect.
Yeah, and I think that in the earlier stages, founders are very keen to take advice from VCs.
Oh, yeah.
But in some cases, those individuals may not have built a company before, right?
I think in Europe, it's probably most cases, right?
In Europe?
Yeah. I mean, what's the stat? Like, it's a significant majority of, I think, investors in Europe have never started a company.
I think it was over 70% of VCs have never actually had operational experience in a company. So I guess, they have seen a lot of companies, and they've gone through, becoming investors through the financial routes.
Yeah.
But how much do they actually know about building a company and then building your company? I think it's quite dangerous in a way, right? Because it seemed to have taken up a lot of your time.
No, for sure. And I think there's a difference between maybe lessons you can learn from the sidelines and lessons you have to learn in the weeds. So I think a really good example of like things you can probably give someone advice on but never really have done yourself is how to sort of play people, like how to do a deal. I feel like that's something that you can nearly give the best advice in the world in, but then when you're actually in the position, you're sort of like, how do I pull this together?
Yeah.
But then there's things that are maybe a little bit more, you actually have to have lived it to be able to give advice on it. And there's just like yourself, like, you know, how many times have you done things that you're like, yeah, I mean, I probably would do that differently if you were to do number two.
Yeah.
And again, like, that's not something you're going to learn reading a blog post or listening to someone, because it's that minor detail that no one really talks about for a specific case.
My observation for VCs is like often the ones that have the operational experience, nothing really phases them.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you know, if you've built a startup, you've probably had like 9 million things go wrong. And so that's the one thing, like with our VCs, is that and like I always rave on about them, but I do really love Nina Capital, because both the partners are ex-founders, and they really empathize and understand when things go wrong, because they've both built companies before. But I can imagine that, you know, if you're just watching from the sidelines and you see all this like shit happening, you're like, oh my gosh, you know, you're probably freaking out because you've never really seen like the extent of how bad things can get.
Yeah.
And as founders, it's like, sometimes that's like, you know, just another Tuesday.
Yeah. Oh, that was a good day. Yeah.
What is the impact you want to leave with Filter?
Giving people the opportunity to like participate in society. You never know where that will go. So like optimizing people's health. And I'm not talking about some person that does 150 kilometers a week on the bike, runs 3 marathons, and, you know, has 6 different whoops and etc. off optimizing them. I'm talking about the people who have unfortunately maybe found themselves in a bad health scenario. If you can help them improve their health, you don't know like what the downstream effect that is for those people. Like, does someone who we help become like a world-class author? Does someone, you know, get to spend a lot of time with their grandkids? Like, the fact that this condition affects, okay, diagnosed 200 million, undiagnosed plus diagnosed probably more like 500 or 600 million. Like, that's a lot of people you can help.